This video is sponsored by Squarespace.
A lot of times, at least for an early modernist like myself, when we think of fortifications and forts, we think of massive complexes, thick, strong walls, lining this vast open field with guns and cannons lining the way, soldiers running all around, shouting orders and bells and yada, 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 all those sorts of things. But I found, I'm visiting a place called Fort Miles in Lewes, Delaware, and I found that you really can't apply that logic with early 20th century fortifications for as short a time as they really had to shine.
The construction of Fort Miles began in 1938 as part of wider American efforts during the 30s and 40s to modernize the United States' coastal defenses. It was mainly located at Cape Henlopen in Delaware and was intended alongside a system of naval minefields to secure the entrance of the Delaware Bay and the city of Philadelphia with her shipyards, as well as other vital wartime industries such as munitions and chemical plants in Wilmington and oil refineries in Chester. Now, I say mainly located because Fort Miles, like most forts of its day, was really quite decentralized. And while its main structures, particularly things like administration buildings and barracks and the like, would have been here at Cape Henlopen, elements of the fort would stretch out along 200 miles worth of shoreline, including some structures in Cape May, New Jersey, clear on the other side of the bay entrance.
Now, some of those are going to be things like barracks buildings, barrack rooms, where the 2,000 some odd garrison would be stationed, when artillerymen and soldiers and, communications people, things like that. But there's also things like batteries scattered all along the coast. We have observation towers and storages and all sorts of different, buildings and whatnot. The fort, quote unquote, is more like a network. It's sort of a massive web of very small, independently operating units that are all in communication with one another. So in this video, what I really want to talk about is just the form in which this base, this fort, if you can really call it that, takes, and how different it is from at least my early modernist conception of what makes up fortifications. And of course how by the end of it all, forts like this even, this very modern, large network canvassing over a very wide area of shore, all in communication with itself and yada, 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 how even such a complicated network, by the end of the Second World War, it was pretty much entirely useless. It was rendered completely obsolete because of how fast and how rapidly the technology was developing. So developing. So talk a little bit about that as well.
So let's talk about the most exciting element of the fort, its guns. Rather than Fort Miles having any one single massive bunker complex lined with guns like some sort of battleship implanted on the shore, the philosophy of the fort was to disperse its firepower while emphasizing its precision over any kind of raw, destructive capacity. Indeed, you may be surprised to learn that at its strongest, the entire fort, remember, a complex that spanned over 200 miles, only boasted 36 guns, or at least that's the number according to its Wikipedia page. And not all of those guns were massive battleship-style ship-sinking guns either. 16 of those 36 guns were smaller than 4 inches, consisting of things like 40mm anti-air guns or 3-inch artillery pieces. Here are some of the 3-inch pieces I found at the fort, and here's a picture of a 40mm anti-air gun, which incidentally is around 1.6 inches, the sorts that they would have had at the fort. Then there were 8 6-inch guns, there were 8 8-inch guns, how very convenient, which were mounted on railway carriages, there were 2 12-inch guns, and finally the really big boys, there were 2 16-inch guns as well.
Now, just for a little bit of added context, here we have one of those 6-inch guns. It's going to take around 25 men to actually operate the piece, and the round that it's firing, the shell it's firing, is about 100 pounds. According to the little plaque here, it depends on what kind of round's being fired. There's, there's a 90-pound high explosive round, and then there's a 105-pound armor-piercing round. See, really, I'm not doing any, I'm just reading the plaques, and then I'm reciting the information to you, and then I'm taking a payday at the end. Best job in the world, folks. Best job in the world. But I think it really does, say something that this is one of the smaller guns that we have during this time period. And, yikes. But, of course, they did get bigger. This is an 8-inch gun. It's amazing. Only a 2-inch difference between the one and the other. And they say size doesn't matter. I'm better than I should. All right, anyways. firing a shell that's just over 250 pounds, I believe it was, 260, something around there. And again, the full length, and oh, if my lovely camera woman can turn around, I think we have a target just across the way there. But of course, they could get even bigger. Unfortunately, that gun is also currently off limits, and I am not quite important enough to justify going over there as an infernal little piece of yellow tape that says caution. I don't know why I have to be cautious about, well, anyways, we can't go there, unfortunately, but, well, I'll find something online to talk about with it.
Now, I couldn't get access to them, I'm afraid, but here's a photo of a 12-inch gun, this one being in Battery 519 at Fort Miles, and then here's a photo that I took of what I believe is one of the 16-inch guns. And if it is the 16-incher, then that piece is able to fire a round weighing some 2,700 pounds and using over 600 pounds of gunpowder to propel it up to just over 26 miles away. Here's a video I found of the USS Wisconsin firing guns of a similar size, just to help you imagine what that might have looked like. Now, the actual opening to the Delaware Bay measures at around 12 miles or so, meaning that these guns in particular, the biggest ones, could be firing at enemy vessels well before they ever reached the mouth of the bay. In fact, those guns could fire so far, it would take nearly a minute, around 50-something seconds, after the round was fired for it to even land, which means that even aiming the piece appropriately is a highly complicated process, but we'll talk about that in just a bit.
Get a load of that thing. Pretty cool, huh?
You know, by the end of the war, Fort Miles was pretty much obsolete. But I'll tell you what isn't obsolete is a website and how much you need one. This video is sponsored by Squarespace, where you can create your own website in just minutes. Don't know anything about fancy codes and scripts and HTMLs and whatever other weird computer things go into making websites? Well, guess what? With Squarespace, you don't need any of that nonsense. Using their industry-leading templates and intuitive design tools, anyone can create a professional-looking website for pretty much any purpose imaginable in just a few minutes. Want to start accepting bookings or selling products online? Well, Squarespace has you covered, and with plenty of analytical tools so you can figure out who is visiting your store, from where, and what they're interested in, so you can tailor your products to meet their needs better and make more sales. Want to publish a blog and start getting your writing out there? Well, with Squarespace, you can not only do that, but you can use their amazing SEO tools to help the world discover your writing, getting it higher up in the Google ratings and all that, and then you can have your readers sign up for an email campaign to easily have your work delivered right to their inbox. Technology is an arms race, and a flashy new website is a great way for you to stay on top. Head on over to squarespace.com/BrandonF today and save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain when you use the code BrandonF. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and now back to Fort Miles. The 16-inch monster of a gun may have been able to fire over twice the distance of the bay's opening, but that doesn't mean the more plentiful smaller guns were anything to balk at either. Those 6-inch guns, for example, were more than capable of firing across the entire length of the bay's entrance. And it's those incredible ranges that in part allowed for this fort to be so incredibly widespread and still be capable of providing crossfire, with multiple batteries all being able to fire on a target from such massively different positions. That way, even if one position is taken down, any enemy would still have to worry about pretty much all of the others that are going to be spread all over the place. It's the same basic idea as having a system of redoubts in an 18th century fort, just on a much, much greater scale. So much greater, in fact, that some elements of this fort, in Delaware, even crossed to the other side of the bay itself to Cape May, New Jersey. So let's hop onto a ferry and cross over to see if we can't find one of those buildings. Brandon on the ground, it's over to you, my friend.
So I'm now on the Cape May side of the Delaware Bay, and this is just one of those many different sort of outbuildings, outposts, sort of other structures that are still a part of the fort, just not in or on the fort. This is battery number, I believe it's 223. It has 6 foot deep or 6 foot, thick concrete walls, and it would house originally a 6-inch, I almost said 6-pounder, it's the 18th century coming at me, a 6-inch gun that was capable of firing about 9 miles, pretty much across the entire distance of the bay. And the striking thing, at least from, my more early modern perspective about buildings like this, is just, looking at the scale of the thing, in the 18th century, this sort of a complex would be a fort all its own. But instead it's just a very small, very, very small part of a much wider defensive complex. This thing had, goodness me, I forgot how many rooms exactly, but I'll have the number listed for you down below. It had a switchboard on the inside, so it could be in communication with the observation towers and the fort on the other side, all those sorts of things. I don't actually know for certain if it can communicate with the fort on the other side. I presume that it can. It had, obviously, ammunition storage. It obviously had the room for the actual, the big gun itself. It even has, if you believe it, what was it called? An airlock kind of thing for if there was ever a chemical weapon dropped on board it, so they could close up, seal up the entire thing, and be able to more or less sustain a military presence inside this complex. But that being said, even though this massive thing is more or less a fort unto itself, able to lob shells, pretty much across the entirety of this little opening for the harbor, for the bay, whatever they call it these days, as if they had a different name for it, but I don't know, I'm rambling. Oh, and one other thing that I wanted to talk about this great big behemoth of a thing, beyond the fact that it's covered in graffiti now, and that's absolutely disgusting. Come on, Cape May, you gotta do better, cleaning these things up, it's important. Is that it didn't always look like this. You can imagine I'm hoping I'm not screaming at you in this little handheld microphone. The wind is rather harsh. You can imagine, if you're some German submariner or some German, even a great big battleship or something that's sailing down up with the intention of bombarding Philadelphia and destroying all of the industry and all the very important munitions plants and whatnots that are up the river, up the way. This is kind of obvious. Look at the thing. Even if it wasn't covered in this garish, white, horrible graffiti, you can see this thing for a pretty long distance on this nice, white, sandy shoreline and the blue water and yada, yada, yada. It's a great big hunk of concrete. Well, of course, they used to, historically, it was actually covered up. They had the entire thing covered in sand and dirt and earth and whatnot, so that it wouldn't be so obvious as all this. And in fact, if you look at the very top of the thing, you could even still see there, there's some grass growing on the very top. Imagine like that, but a lot more, to where it's nice, it's hidden away from view, it's low down on the earth, and yet still, because of those observation towers, because of just how amazing 20th century technology is compared to, us silly old 18th century folks, it's still able to conduct, a battle, still able to lob shells, again, fairly accurately at these tiny little targets up to 9 miles away. That's like, it's going to take a couple of seconds for the shot to even hit at that point. That's why you have the observation towers. I'm really rambling now because these are all things that are presumably being talked about in other parts of this video. But in fact, this is the first part of the video that I'm recording because I'm staying in Cape May and Lewes is on the other side. I have to catch a ferry to go there tomorrow.
Okay. Calm down, Brent. It's okay. I'll take it from here. Anyways, I mentioned something about those observation towers, and that brings us to another question related to the fort's armament. That being, how on earth were these guns even aimed? It's all well and good to be able to shoot those 16-inch cannons a marathon's distance away, but that really isn't terribly useful if you can't actually see that far, now is it? And again, these guns are often being laid lower in the ground and surrounded by concrete, so trying to spot an enemy ship from these firing positions is going to be difficult. And again, add on to any aiming difficulties the fact that your target is moving and that it's going to take up to a minute for your shell to even land after it's been fired. That's a complicated job. It's also not going to help that if you're going up against a great big fleet of enemy ships, you're almost certainly going to be outgunned. I know it's a silly idea to expect a German fleet to invade the Delaware Bay, but we have the hindsight of history, and that is the kind of thing that this fort was designed to prevent. And if the Germans did somehow manage to sail something like, say, the Bismarck up to the fort, just another, iconic example. It's silly, I know, but, one ship, well, that alone would already be enough to overpower the fort in terms of raw firepower. And again, you saw that footage earlier of the battleship. While the fort had two 16-inch guns, that thing had, quite a good few of them. So if Fort Miles is going to be sinking German battleships, she needs to fire her guns quickly and, above all else, highly accurately. She needs to be making her range count, and she needs to be scoring as many hits as possible, as early on as possible, before her gunnery positions are spotted and blown out of the ground. But how, you may ask, are the guns of the fort meant to be so accurate when they usually can't even see the ships that they're meant to be aiming at?
And the answer is to be found in one of these. This is an observation tower, a rather significantly sized thing, as you can see. The entire idea is that you line the coastline with towers exactly like this, and just on the trip over to this side of the bay, we saw them just dotting all along the coastline.
Here, for example, you can see a few of the towers in Henlopen State Park itself. I took this photo from the ferry ride over, and here there's one nestled quite seamlessly into the port area. These towers would vary in their height, and I would assume depending on the range of the guns they were associated with, as well as the more obvious factors of the height of the ground they were being built on, but the tallest of them was around 75 feet high, and originally you'd scale it by a ladder on the inside, although thankfully it's since been replaced with a staircase, which was much more YouTuber-friendly. The tower walls were a foot thick and made of reinforced concrete, although they were never armed. The top of each tower would host observation decks, varying in number based on the tower's height. This one, for example, has 2 interior levels, and then the roof as well could serve as a 3rd observation level. Each of these levels would play host to a variety of instruments designed to help the tower spot and identify enemy vessels, determine their location and speed, and then relay that information back to a central location. But it's not like these towers would rely on their view distance alone to aim the batteries hidden down below. The towers would be paired in two, with the distance between them being calculated beforehand, and then once they take their measurements, they would radio them down to battery command. Those 3 measurements could then be laid onto a plotting board, like the one you see here, allowing the soldiers to triangulate, and I'm sure you can see why it's called that, the enemy ship's real position. You do that 2 or 3 times, and you can determine the rough speed of the ship as well. You know, where it was, where it now is, how long has passed, that's how fast the ship is going. And once you know the ship's current position and its speed, assuming that it isn't pulling any funny business, it's a pretty easy matter to then calculate where the target's going to be in the time that it takes your shell, recently fired, to land. Plug in a few extra formulas and devices to accommodate for weather and wind and the like, and you have the precise angle at which to fire your gun. So you radio it into the actual gun battery, and hopefully they can give 'em hell. It's a highly complicated and precise system that requires multiple working parts to be used effectively, yes, but when it's done properly, this system would allow the fort to be firing its largest guns even to their fullest effect, and certainly more accurately than any enemy ships, which wouldn't have the luxury of so many unmoving variables, being the towers, in their targeting systems. Fort Miles itself had 13 of these such towers scattered across its length, with 11 on the Delaware side and then 2 in Cape May for the guns placed on the New Jersey side. And this sort of network only becomes possible with radio communication, permitting 3 or 4 different structures being distantly placed from one another to all be in constant communication. So not only was the fort spread out over those 200 miles to help protect its individual batteries, it was also vital for those guns to be able to function properly. Like I mentioned earlier, while at any prior points in history this sort of operation would instead be labeled as a network of independently operating fortifications and military outposts, in the 20th century, because of the improvements in communications technology and various other technologies, which allowed these different structures to all be acting on the same wavelength, and pun intended there, rather than independently of each other, we are instead able to label this massive network as a single fort, just with a lot of different working parts. But unfortunately for the militarized boffins who designed the whole thing, as impressive as it was, I'm afraid that Fort Miles was also fairly useless. I mean, I'm sure it was a great deterrent, especially its naval minefield in preventing U-boats from sailing up the Delaware, but at the end of the day, it was a fortification, or series of fortifications, a complex, however you want to describe it. It was designed to guard against surface ships in a raid or invasion that never came, and at least in my layman's opinion, was never really at risk of coming either. I mean, don't get me wrong, it wasn't a bad idea to build it at the time, it's just that the way things went, being a good way, it never really saw any use, never really had too much of a chance to see use either, again, except for that minefield. The fort never fired a shot in anger, and only really saw an enemy when U-boat 858 surrendered to the fort in 1945. And meanwhile, just outside of the fort's reach, Axis submarines would continue to be sinking Allied shipping. And of course, by the end of the Second World War, these sorts of fixed defensive fortifications, like Fort Miles, were already pretty outdated. Improvements in things like amphibious landing technology meant that you could not only land entire armies pretty much anywhere you like so long as it had a beach, but you could even sustain them without the use of any major port cities. I mean, look at the invasion of Normandy, or pretty much the entirety of the Pacific theater. Those sorts of massive scale landings would have been fantasy just 40, 50 years prior. But by the end of the Second World War, well, the world was pretty experienced in how to conduct themselves with that kind of thing. I mean, I know that I'm grossly oversimplifying things here in this explanation of why things like Fort Miles were pretty much obsolete, but I'm not so interested in world history after 1945. It's not something that I know as much about, and it's really not why we're here. I'm sure there are going to be comments down below that can add a little bit more context as to why exactly. Besides, I think that we all know as well that after the Second World War, the world was pretty dualistic in terms of the great powers, and if one of those two sides decided to give a war, well then I doubt that the Soviets would be sending a battleship if they wanted to destroy the Philadelphia shipyards. But in any case, that was Fort Miles. Less of a fort, as my early modernist mind usually conceives of the things, more of a massive, complicated network, a web, some 200 miles long, of towers and batteries and the like, all communicating with each other and serving a common purpose of defending the Delaware Bay from any ne'er-do-wells. Goodness me, the 20th century gets confusing. It's too many numbers, too much math, everything's so big. Anyways. Thank you so very much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and thank you all for watching, most particularly to my ever-beneficent supporting classes on patreon.com, by virtue of whose support I am able to carry on with my work. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.
I mean, seriously, people, eat your parents. There's one that just says sex over there. Like, this isn't, it's not creative. It's not mind over, ooh, I am very deep. It's a scholar right there, mind over matter. Come on. It's a World War II like, come on.